I am Julian, 34 years old. For 15 long, agonizing years, I bled for my family's construction empire. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and nearly my sanity building a $1.2 billion pipeline business from the Texas mud up to the boardroom, only to be fired at 1 in the morning so my father could hand my entire life's work to my spoiled, incompetent half-brother. While I was sitting in my home office, severely sleep-deprived and desperately trying to secure an environmental safety clearance to prevent a catastrophic lawsuit that could bankrupt the company, my own father called me. With zero hesitation and absolutely zero remorse, he told me my position was being eliminated for administrative efficiency. They were laughing about it. Through the phone speaker, I could literally hear my 26-year-old brother revving the engine of his brand new Porsche in the background, while my father erased my entire career over a 3-minute phone call. But there is one massive thing they did not know. They foolishly thought my value was tied to their corporate servers and the family name printed on my business card. They had absolutely no idea that I held the ultimate trump card, a quiet, ruthless negotiation that would legally strip them of their most valuable asset and leave them financially bleeding, standing on my doorstep begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their toxic, narcissistic empire and secured the ultimate justice, hit that like button if you firmly believe that hard work and loyalty should always triumph over nepotism and greed. And please, drop a comment down below letting me know what city or state you are watching from today. I love seeing where my supporters are located. Now, let us go back to the exact moment my family finally showed their true colors and signed their own corporate death warrant. It was exactly 1:05 a.m. on a Tuesday. The harsh, blue glow of 4 oversized computer monitors illuminated my home office just outside the city limits of Houston, Texas. The house was dead silent, but my digital world was screaming. I was nursing my 3rd cup of black, bitter coffee, my eyes burning as I watched the real-time telemetry data flooding in from 3 massive pipeline projects scattered across Texas and Oklahoma. We had a critical, incredibly sensitive section of a Chevron pipeline in Odessa that needed a flawless Environmental Protection Agency inspection clearance by sunrise. In the high-stakes world of oil and gas infrastructure, deadlines are not polite suggestions. Missing a single regulatory milestone by an hour can instantly trigger penalty clauses that wipe out an entire month of corporate profit, or worse, invite a federal lawsuit that shuts down the entire grid. That means someone always has to be the night watchman. Someone has to sit in the dark, monitoring the deep trench pressure gauges, approving the overnight crew rotations, and tracking the severe weather patterns when things inevitably go sideways. For a decade and a half, that someone was always me. My cell phone vibrated violently against the heavy oak wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed my father's name, Gregory. I felt a familiar, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. A phone call from the chief executive officer at this ungodly hour usually meant a catastrophic equipment failure, a severe worker injury, or a political nightmare with local authorities. I picked up the phone on the second ring, my eyes still frantically scanning the equipment diagnostic screens for our Corpus Christi site. I answered the phone with my standard, rapid-fire operational greeting. I asked him what was broken, which site was down, and which emergency crew I needed to dispatch. My father did not waste time with pleasantries, nor did he acknowledge the sheer exhaustion in my voice. His tone was ice-cold, purely corporate, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth or basic human empathy. He spoke to me as if I were a stranger who had just cold-called his office. He stated that he was calling to inform me of an immediate organizational restructuring that directly affected my position within the company. I stopped typing. My hands hovered frozen over the mechanical keyboard. The silence in my home office suddenly felt suffocating, broken only by the low, steady hum of my computer tower cooling fans. I asked him to repeat himself, genuinely thinking my sleep-deprived brain had misunderstood his words. He did not hesitate. He spoke with the measured, robotic cadence of a man reading a highly sanitized legal document prepared by an extremely expensive corporate lawyer. He stated clearly that my position as senior project director was being eliminated, effective immediately. He went on to explain that they were consolidating all project oversight under the newly created role of Vice President of Strategic Development. He claimed this move was necessary to bring a more streamlined, modern approach to our infrastructure management. I felt the blood rapidly drain from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. A wave of pure disbelief crashed into me. I reminded him, my voice rising in panic, that I was currently actively managing 3 live construction sites worth over $1.2 billion in active contracts. I reminded him that we had federal safety inspections scheduled for the very next morning that required my specific, personalized digital signatures. I begged him to apply some logic to the situation and asked if this conversation could at least wait until normal business hours when the sun was actually up. He flatly refused. He told me the decision was finalized by the board and must be implemented immediately for administrative efficiency. Administrative efficiency. It was a sterile, gutless, deeply insulting phrase. I felt a surge of hot anger break through my shock. I demanded to know exactly who was taking over project oversight for the current night operations. I needed a name of the person who was going to keep my men safe in the trenches tonight. My father cleared his throat. It was a specific, arrogant sound I knew intimately, a sound that meant he was about to deliver the killing blow and expect me to simply bow my head and accept it. He announced with a sickening amount of pride that Preston, our new Vice President of Strategic Development, would officially assume full responsibility for all project functions and personnel. He actually had the audacity to claim that Preston had extensive visionary experience with infrastructure optimization. Preston, my 26-year-old half-brother. This was a kid who had never worn a hard hat in his entire life. He had never stood in the blistering, 100-degree Texas heat negotiating with a stubborn union contractor. He had never read a single page of an OSHA safety manual. Preston was a textbook, undeniable golden child who had spent his massive college fund on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and bottle service at exclusive clubs. He dropped out of 2 different prestigious universities before my stepmother finally threw a tantrum and demanded he be given a corner office and a 6-figure salary at the family company. Right at that moment, through the phone speaker, I heard the distinct, aggressive, roaring exhaust of a high-end sports car. It was the Porsche 911 that the company had just leased for Preston as a signing bonus. Preston was right there with him. They were likely sitting in the sprawling, brick-paved driveway of my father's gated real estate property, making this life-destroying phone call together. I tried desperately to inject some shred of reality into a clearly irrational, deeply dangerous situation. I told my father that our pipeline operations were not something you hand off with a polite memo and a pat on the back. I explicitly explained there were complex inspector relationships, fragile environmental compliance issues, and severe weather contingencies that could shut down a major project and invite a massive class action lawsuit faster than he could blink. My father patronized me. He used that condescending, soothing tone reserved for calming down unreasonable children. He said the board deeply appreciated my past dedication, but they had complete, unwavering confidence in their transition planning. He told me Preston brought a much-needed fresh perspective to operational challenges that had clearly become overly complex and bogged down under my rigid management style. He then issued a direct, non-negotiable order. He commanded me to cease all project activities immediately and manually transfer all of my administrative access credentials to Preston's account by 2 a.m. I stared blankly at my glowing screens. I looked at the names of the site supervisors logging their hours, men I had worked with for years, men whose families relied on my competence to bring them home safely. I looked at the severe thunderstorm alerts rapidly approaching the Tulsa quadrant. My father was casually holding a lit match over a massive powder keg, and he was completely, willfully blind to the explosive danger. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I told him I understood. I promised to transfer my access credentials within the hour. He sounded immensely relieved, almost smug with victory. He told me the Human Resources Department would contact me regarding my final salary payout, the termination of my company health insurance, and my transition documentation. Then the line went dead. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. That was all the time it took for my own flesh and blood to erase 15 years of my grueling life's work. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair, letting the harsh, bitter reality wash over me. The transition process felt exactly like unhooking life support from a patient you knew was going to die without it. Systematically, methodically, I began revoking my own high-level administrative rights. I transferred the safety dashboards, the encrypted contractor networks, the regulatory compliance protocols, and the emergency override codes. Every single click of my mouse severed a deeply personal tie to the empire I had built with my bare hands for them. At exactly 2:23 a.m., my cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but the prefix belonged to the company's internal executive exchange. I answered it, my voice devoid of any emotion. Preston's voice came through the speaker, dripping with unearned, arrogant confidence. He casually introduced himself by his brand-new, unearned title and asked for a quick, high-level rundown of the night's active operations. I could clearly hear the sharp clinking of ice in a crystal glass on his end. He was treating this billion-dollar infrastructure handover like a casual fraternity management exercise. I told him straight up that I had transferred all the access credentials exactly as requested and that he now held full, unrestricted project oversight. He chuckled, a light, breezy sound. He asked if there were any immediate concerns he needed to worry about. I looked at the black monitors I was no longer legally authorized to manage. I told him he needed to independently check the project dashboards for the current status, firmly reminding him that I was officially no longer involved in any operational decisions. Preston audibly scoffed, clearly annoyed that I was not doing his job for him. He asked for a quick orientation, demanding just a few bullet points on what he should prioritize so he could go to sleep. He was drowning in the deep end before he even realized he had touched the water. I decided to maliciously comply and give him exactly what he asked for. I rattled off the high-priority items. I listed the strict EPA compliance verification happening in Odessa at dawn, the severe equipment maintenance issues threatening the main pump station in Corpus Christi, and the complex union crew rotation schedule in Tulsa that had to be handled delicately. Preston casually repeated the names of the cities back to me, completely dismissing the technical complexity of every single issue. He yawned loudly into the phone and asked if there was anything else he should watch out for. I warned him, my voice dropping an octave, that these were not simple desk jobs. I told him point blank that when something goes mechanically wrong on a high-pressure pipeline, you have about 10 minutes to make the exact right call before it costs serious money or gets an innocent worker killed. He completely brushed off my warning. He told me that sounded perfect and manageable. Then, he had the absolute nerve to ask if he could call me back later that night if he ran into any confusing spreadsheets. I paused. I let the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out between us for a long time, making sure my next words carried the undeniable weight of a judge reading a final sentence. I formally informed Preston that I was no longer employed by the company as of 2 hours ago. I strongly advised him to coordinate directly with the site managers for any operational support, because he was entirely on his own. Preston stammered, his fake confidence shattering instantly. He said he thought he was merely taking over from me in the morning after a transition meeting. He admitted, panicking, that he had not reviewed a single document regarding the current operations or been briefed on any of the ongoing, critical safety issues. My father had ruthlessly fired the only person actively keeping the company afloat and handed the steering wheel to a spoiled child who did not even know he was supposed to be driving the car. I suggested he immediately contact our father to clarify his massive new responsibilities. Then, without waiting for his response, I hung up the phone. Right as I placed the phone face down on my desk, my primary monitor, which was still in the final stages of logging me out, flashed a stark, flashing red warning box. It was a critical pressure valve irregularity in Corpus Christi. The automated system was desperately trying to alert the administrator to prevent a blowout. But I was officially no longer the administrator. I reached down and physically unplugged the monitors from the wall, plunging the room into total darkness. I truly thought the worst of the betrayal was over. I was so incredibly, painfully wrong. To truly understand the sheer cruelty and absolute devastation of that 1:05 a.m. phone call, You have to understand the deeply toxic, horribly skewed dynamic of my family. I was the child of my father's first marriage. My biological mother passed away when I was very young, a memory that feels more like a faded photograph than a real lived experience. Her passing left me entirely in the care of Gregory, a man whose only true, genuine affection was reserved strictly for massive corporate profit margins and his flawless public image in the wealthy Houston social circles. I was, in every sense of the word, the invisible son. I learned very early in my childhood that the only possible way to earn even a microscopic scrap of validation from Gregory was through relentless, grueling, physical and mental labor. I vividly remember being 20 years old, spending my entire Thanksgiving holiday weekend knee-deep in freezing, toxic Texas mud. I was helping a skeletal emergency crew repair a burst industrial pipe because we absolutely could not afford to lose our biggest client. While I was out there in the freezing rain, risking pneumonia and severe physical injury, my father was flying on a chartered private jet to a luxury ski resort in Aspen. He was with his second wife, Sylvia, and my darling, pampered half-brother, Preston, who was just 12 at the time. I paid for my own college fund by working grueling double shifts on dangerous construction sites during my summer breaks. I managed my modest, entry-level salary with extreme discipline, quietly putting away every spare dollar into a 401k and an emergency fund, terrified that if the family business ever went under, I would be left completely homeless while they retreated to their offshore accounts. Preston, on the other hand, existed on an entirely different planet. From the exact moment he was born, Sylvia made absolutely sure he was treated like untouchable royalty. She was a master psychological manipulator, a woman who specialized in planting toxic, destructive seeds disguised as sweet maternal concern. She expertly used every extravagant family dinner, every elite HOA meeting, every country club social gathering to subtly, systematically undermine my achievements while completely fabricating and elevating her own son's non-existent accomplishments. I remember a specific Thanksgiving dinner just 3 years ago that perfectly encapsulates my entire existence in that family. The massive dining table was practically groaning under the weight of expensive catered food and imported wines. Sylvia stood up, tapped her manicured fingernail against her crystal wine glass to command the room's attention, and beamed with pride. She loudly announced to the extended family that she and Gregory had just purchased a massive, multi-million-dollar piece of commercial real estate downtown, completely in Preston's name, purely for his future investment portfolio. Preston was 23 years old at the time. He was chronically unemployed, still living in their mansion, and was currently facing a very serious potential civil lawsuit for drunkenly crashing his car into a neighbor's expensive wrought iron fence. During that exact same dinner, just 10 minutes after her grand announcement, I quietly pulled my father aside. I practically begged him to approve a modest budget increase for upgraded, heavy-duty safety harnesses for my deep trench crews who were working in highly dangerous conditions. Sylvia overheard us. She glided over, flashed her venomous, perfectly practiced pageant smile, and placed a hand on my father's chest. She looked at my father and dramatically sighed, stating loudly that Julian always wanted to waste the company's hard-earned money on unnecessary overhead and coddling the laborers. She claimed, with a straight face, that I simply did not understand the grand vision of corporate growth and wealth accumulation like Preston intuitively did. My father, completely mesmerized by her, simply nodded and agreed with her. My safety budget for the men risking their lives was flatly denied so Preston could have another asset in his portfolio. That was my entire life story. I was the silent, reliable workhorse pulling the heavy carriage through the mud, while Preston and Sylvia sat inside on velvet cushions, loudly complaining about the minor bumps in the road. I was the one who built the critical relationships with the gritty blue-collar workers. I earned the grudging respect of the notoriously strict federal EPA inspectors. I secured the massive corporate contracts that actively paid for Sylvia's endless designer wardrobe and Preston's ridiculous monthly allowances. I did it all because I suffered from a pathetic, deep-seated delusion that eventually, someday, my father would look at the massive empire I built for him and finally see my worth as a son. The night before my brutal termination, the underlying tension in my life had reached a boiling point. My fiancée, Nina, and I were sitting in the kitchen of our modest home. Nina was a brilliant, highly pragmatic woman who saw right through my family's golden facade from the very first day she met them. She watched me sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing hundreds of pages of complex environmental compliance documents for the Odessa site. My eyes were bloodshot. My hands were shaking slightly from caffeine overload. I had barely slept more than 4 hours total in 3 days. Nina walked over and firmly placed her hand over my paperwork, forcing me to stop reading. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I was literally killing myself for people who would gladly replace me before my funeral was even over. She begged me to look at my own life. We had talked for years about buying our own real estate, about starting a family, about taking a vacation that did not involve me answering emergency emails. But my entire existence was completely, totally consumed by my father's company. I defended them out of a deeply ingrained, trauma-bonded habit. I told her I just needed to get this massive Chevron project across the finish line. I promised her, yet again, that things would fundamentally change after this financial quarter. I boldly promised I would finally demand a promotion to a senior partner level, forcing my father to give me the legal equity I deserved. Nina looked at me with a heartbreaking mixture of deep pity and sheer frustration. She said they were never, ever going to give me equity. She warned me, her voice dropping to a serious whisper, that Sylvia was actively positioning Preston for a complete corporate takeover. I told Nina she was being paranoid. I truly, foolishly believed that despite their blatant favoritism, my father was a cutthroat businessman first and foremost. He would never risk the company's massive bottom line and operational stability just to appease his wife's ego. I was an absolute fool. Later that evening, around 9 p.m., my personal cell phone rang. It was Fiona, our company's director of human resources. Calling an employee on a Sunday night was highly irregular, almost unheard of. Fiona and I had a mutual, quiet respect for one another. She was one of the very few executives in the corporate office who actually saw the spreadsheets and understood exactly how hard I worked to keep the company profitable. Her voice was hushed, trembling slightly, as if she was terrified of being overheard in her own home. She told me she was absolutely not supposed to be making this phone call. She said she was sitting in her home office, staring at a stack of highly sensitive transition documents that Uncle Wallace had just emailed her, marked strictly confidential. Uncle Wallace was Sylvia's brother. He was a snake of a man who sat comfortably on our board of directors, a man who produced absolutely nothing of value but constantly whispered toxic poison in my father's ear to elevate his sister's status. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked Fiona exactly. They were not firing me because of performance issues. They were amputating me from the family tree to legally steal my inheritance. Fiona told me she was being forced to process the paperwork in the morning, or she would risk losing her own job and her pension. She apologized profusely, crying softly into the phone, and hung up. I sat in the dark kitchen for a very long time. The betrayal I felt was not a sharp, sudden stab. It was a slow, suffocating poison seeping into my veins. My own father was entirely willing to destroy my hard-earned career, ruin my professional reputation, and completely steal my financial future just to secure a massive, unearned payout for the son who had never worked a single hard day in his entire life. When the actual phone call from my father finally came hours later at 1:05 a.m., I was not surprised. I was not shocked. I was just profoundly, deeply hollowed out. I gave them exactly what they wanted without a fight. I handed over the digital keys to the castle. But as I watched the system flash that final red warning light in Corpus Christi, a new, entirely different feeling began to replace. The morning immediately following my termination began with a strange, heavy, unnatural silence. For the past 15 years of my life, my mornings involved a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, urgent text messages, and rapid-fire emails demanding my immediate attention. I usually woke up feeling like a seasoned general stepping directly onto an active battlefield. But on this Wednesday morning, the bright Texas sun rose over the horizon, and my company-issued smartphone sat dead and dark on my nightstand, permanently deactivated by human resources. I walked heavily into the kitchen at exactly 6 a.m. Nina was already awake, standing by the counter making fresh coffee. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something was fundamentally, irreparably broken. I sat down heavily at the kitchen island, buried my face in my hands, and told her everything. I told her about the brutal 1:05 a.m. phone call, about my father handing the reins to Preston, and about Fiona's devastating warning regarding the impending corporate sale and the theft of my inheritance. Nina did not offer empty platitudes. She did not say a single word. She just walked over, wrapped her arms tightly around my shaking shoulders, and held me. Her silent, unwavering support gave me the emotional anchor I desperately needed to keep from completely falling apart. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the silence was shattered. My personal cell phone, the number only my closest crew chiefs possessed, began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop. It did not stop for 20 agonizing minutes. By the time I finally picked it up, I had 14 missed calls and nearly 30 panicked text messages. They were from seasoned shift supervisors, logistics coordinators, and safety inspectors across 3 different area codes. Every single one of them was desperately asking for operational guidance. They either could not reach Preston at all, or far worse, Preston was actively giving them instructions that defied the laws of physics and basic safety protocols. The first call I actually chose to answer was from Matteo. Matteo was a grizzled, deeply respected veteran site supervisor who had been working in the trenches with me since my very first day on the job. He was a fiercely loyal ally, a man who viewed the physical safety of his crew as his own personal religion. Matteo was practically shouting over the deafening noise of heavy diesel machinery idling in the background. He demanded to know where the hell I was. He said the Odessa site was in a state of complete, unmitigated chaos. Lancaster, the most ruthless, unforgiving federal EPA inspector in the entire state of Texas, had arrived unannounced for the critical dawn compliance check. I felt my stomach drop. I asked Matteo what went wrong. I knew for a fact that I had prepared the compliance documentation perfectly the night before I was fired. Matteo cursed loudly in Spanish before switching back to English. He explained that Preston had somehow managed to access the administrative system, deleted the finalized, encrypted compliance folder I had prepared, and arrogantly handed Lancaster an outdated draft from 3 months ago. A draft that lacked all the newly required environmental sign-offs and soil testing results. Lancaster took one look at the fraudulent paperwork, declared the entire site a massive environmental hazard, and officially shut down the entire operation on the spot. A full shutdown by the EPA is a corporate nightmare. It meant endless federal audits, site lockouts, and potential daily fines that could bleed a construction company dry in a matter of weeks. I took a deep breath. I told Matteo I was incredibly sorry, but I had been officially terminated the night before. I told him he had to route all operational authority and crisis management through Preston now. Matteo fell dead silent on the other end of the line. He asked me, his voice trembling with anger, if this was some kind of sick joke. When I assured him I was entirely serious and legally bound to stay away, Matteo let out a sound of pure, visceral disgust. He told me the company was going to burn to the ground by noon. He hung up to go deal with the federal agents currently swarming his job site. The first massive domino had officially fallen. At 7:45 a.m., my personal phone rang again. The caller ID boldly showed my father's private number. I sat at the kitchen island and let it ring 3 times, watching the screen flash, before finally picking up. I answered with a flat, completely emotionless tone. My father did not bother saying good morning. He sounded highly stressed, his perfectly polished corporate facade cracking severely at the edges. He told me, speaking very quickly, that they were experiencing some unforeseen operational friction this morning. He demanded, not asked, that I log back into the system from my home computer and walk Preston through the EPA mitigation process step by step to appease Lancaster. I leaned back. My father lost his temper. He raised his voice, shouting into the receiver. He told me this was not a childish game. He immediately brought up the concept of family loyalty, trying to manipulate my guilt. He had the absolute, staggering audacity to tell me that after everything he had supposedly done for me, feeding me, housing me, employing me. I owed it to the family legacy to help them through this difficult transition. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. I told him he fired me at 1 in the morning like a dog to protect Preston's unearned inheritance and secure his own payout. I told him he made his bed with Sylvia and Uncle Wallace, and now he could sit back and watch Preston set the entire empire on fire. Without waiting for his furious reply, I hung up the phone and permanently blocked his number. The storm had officially breached the corporate gates. By 2:15 p.m., the situation violently escalated from a severe administrative nightmare to a life-threatening physical emergency. My phone rang again. It was Hector, the brilliant lead mechanical engineer stationed at the Corpus Christi main pump station. Hector was a man who knew the internal sound of a failing industrial valve before the sophisticated computer sensors even registered a warning. Hector sounded utterly terrified. He told me I had to get down to the site immediately, regardless of my employment status. I asked Hector, my heart pounding, if he had executed Preston's order. Hector said no. He said he flatly refused, and Preston completely lost his mind. Preston started screaming at him in front of the crew, threatening to fire him on the spot and ruin his career. Preston then brought over Derek to enforce the order. Derek. He used to be my trusted assistant. I had mentored him for years, trained him from the ground up, and fiercely protected his job during 2 rounds of corporate budget cuts. But Derek was a slimy political creature. When he saw the wind shifting toward Preston and Sylvia, he happily jumped ship. Derek was currently trying to brown-nose his way into a massive promotion by blindly backing Preston's reckless, idiotic commands. Derek aggressively told Hector that if he did not push the override button, Derek would do it himself. I felt a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I told Hector to listen to me very carefully. I instructed him to step far away from the control panel. I told him to gather his loyal crew, evacuate the pump station immediately, run to the safe zone, and refuse to touch a single piece of equipment. I told him bluntly that if Derek or Preston wanted to blow themselves up playing construction worker, Hector was not going to be in the blast radius. Hector thanked me, his voice shaking with relief. I heard him yelling at his crew in Spanish to evacuate just as the call ended. 10 agonizing minutes later, I received a text message from Hector. It was a large video file. My hands shook as I opened it. The shaky cell phone video showed the interior of the pump station from a safe distance outside the blast doors. Preston and Derek were standing near the main control console, arguing. Derek, trying to look like a hero, reached forward and pulled the heavy red override lever. The sound was absolutely deafening, even through the tiny phone speaker. A massive, horrifying metallic groan echoed through the concrete facility, followed by a violent shudder that shook Hector's camera. A high-pressure steel valve completely blew off its mount like a cannonball. It sent a massive, violent geyser of thick industrial sludge, water, and debris blasting straight into the ceiling, destroying the overhead lighting and raining down hazardous material. The video perfectly captured Preston turning pale white with sheer terror. He dropped his expensive, unused hard hat and literally sprinted toward the emergency exit, leaving his men behind. A follow-up text from Hector confirmed the absolute worst-case scenario. The pump station's internal mechanics were completely destroyed. The entire multi-million-dollar project was delayed by at least 2 months. Preston had literally fled the scene in his Ferrari, leaving Derek covered head to toe in toxic sludge, coughing, and facing the immediate wrath of the local hazardous materials authorities. I set my phone down on the counter. The sheer magnitude of their incompetence was staggering to behold. In less than 14 hours since firing me, they had triggered a massive federal EPA shutdown and completely destroyed a $250,000 piece of critical infrastructure. But the final, ultimate, most unforgivable betrayal was still waiting for me in my inbox. I opened my personal laptop to check my emails. Sitting right at the top of my inbox was a message from Fiona in HR. The subject line simply read, "I am so sorry. You need to see this before they delete the servers." Attached was a forwarded, highly confidential internal email chain. It was a communication between Sylvia, Uncle Wallace, and my father dated exactly 3 weeks ago. I read the cruel words on the glowing screen, and the very last shred of my familial loyalty turned instantly to ash. Sylvia had written the initial email. She outlined a detailed, deeply sinister step-by-step plan to provoke me, exhaust me with impossible workloads, and ultimately terminate me for insubordination. She explicitly stated to my father that my operational success and deep relationships with the clients were making me far too valuable to the potential acquisition buyers. She argued, using cold financial terms, that if I remained employed during the sale, I would have the power to demand a massive salary increase or a huge equity share that would severely cut into Preston's ultimate inheritance payout. Uncle Wallace replied to the chain, proudly confirming he had legally drafted the bulletproof termination papers to ensure I had absolutely zero legal grounds for a wrongful termination lawsuit. But the final reply, the one that broke something inside me forever, was from my own father. My father wrote, "Julian has served his purpose. He built the foundation, but we need the corporate structure clean and unencumbered for the acquisition. Move forward with Preston's promotion immediately. Julian is resilient. He will land on his feet somewhere else. Make sure his severance is minimal to protect our liquidity." Served his purpose. I was nothing but a disposable tool. A piece of heavy machinery they used relentlessly until my gears wore down. By late Thursday afternoon, the eerie, terrifying eye of the storm had fully settled over the company's luxurious corporate headquarters. The operational chaos in the field had rapidly reached a critical mass, resulting in a paralyzing, incredibly expensive stalemate. The Odessa site was completely locked down by federal agents, with Lancaster actively threatening massive daily fines. The Corpus Christi pump station was effectively a hazardous crime scene of gross industrial negligence. And up in Tulsa, the third and final pillar of my father's crumbling empire was collapsing entirely under the weight of Preston's spectacular, unchecked arrogance. Gideon was our primary, most vital logistics contractor in Tulsa. He was an old-school, gruff, heavily scarred veteran of the construction industry who operated strictly on a rigid code of personal respect and firm handshake agreements. Gideon and I had a mutual, deep understanding. I always respected his timelines, I paid his men on time, and in return, he delivered absolute miracles when the unpredictable Texas weather turned against us. Word of my midnight termination had spread through the tight-knit industry grapevine faster than a dry brush wildfire. Gideon knew I was gone. When Preston desperately attempted to conduct a mandatory video conference call to aggressively reorganize the delayed Tulsa schedule, he treated Gideon like a disposable subordinate rather than a vital, independent partner. Preston arrogantly demanded that Gideon double his current crew size by the next morning without increasing the budget by a single cent, actively threatening to terminate his lucrative contract and ruin his reputation if he refused. Gideon, a man who survived 2 tours in Vietnam and decades in the oil fields, did not argue. He did not yell. He simply looked into the camera, told Preston to go back to kindergarten, and ended the call. Within an hour, Gideon ordered his entire massive fleet of excavators, bulldozers, and heavy transport trucks to pack up and drive entirely off the site. In a single, devastating afternoon, the Tulsa project went from being slightly behind schedule to being completely and utterly abandoned. Preston was now in a full-blown, hyperventilating panic. The golden child was finally, painfully realizing that his fancy vice president title and his expensive tailored suits were absolutely useless without the deeply ingrained institutional respect required to actually enforce his authority. In a frantic, desperate bid to salvage his rapidly disintegrating reputation before my father found out the extent of the damage, Preston ordered Derek to digitally hack into my old, secured administrative files. They were desperately hunting for my Fiona, risking her own job, texted me live, play-by-play updates from the corporate office. She vividly described Derek sweating profusely in his cubicle, typing frantically, trying everything to bypass the multiple security layers and biometric locks I had built over the years. What Derek eventually discovered, and what Preston entirely failed to comprehend, was the second major, devastating twist of their grand, foolish scheme. There were no magic digital files to steal. I did not manage the vast logistics network through a simple software program they could copy and paste. I did not keep a secret, easily accessible spreadsheet of emergency solutions on a shared drive. My entire operational system, the very lifeblood of the company's success, was heavily encrypted in the one place they could never ever access. My own brain and the deep personal relationships I had carefully cultivated over a decade and a half. Derek eventually had to do the walk of shame into Preston's corner office and admit total defeat. He had to explicitly explain that the company did not actually own the solutions to the current company-killing crises because the solutions were based entirely on human trust. Gideon walked off the job because he trusted me, Julian, not the fancy company logo printed on Preston's business card. Hector saved his crew's lives because he listened to the authority in my voice, not Preston's hysterical screaming. By firing me, they had literally fired the only true asset that actually held the fragile company together. While they were drowning in their air-conditioned conference rooms, frantically trying to figure out how to hide the massive, multi-million-dollar damage from the aggressive acquisition firm, I was in my bedroom, calmly putting on my best tailored suit. I kissed Nina goodbye, feeling a strange, incredibly powerful sense of calm wash over my entire body. I was no longer grieving the loss of my toxic family. I was not going to a funeral. I was going to a resurrection. I drove my truck downtown to a quiet, dimly lit, incredibly expensive and exclusive steakhouse in the heart of Houston. I walked past the host and headed straight to a private, leather-bound booth in the back corner. Sitting confidently at the table, sipping a neat bourbon, was Marcus. Marcus was the formidable chief executive officer of Apex Infrastructure, our largest, most aggressive, and most heavily funded competitor in the southern region. Marcus was an absolute shark in a tailored suit. He was ruthless, brilliant, and notoriously difficult to please. For 5 long years, my father and Uncle Wallace had been locked in a bitter, highly public rivalry with Apex, constantly losing massive bids to them by razor-thin, humiliating margins. But Marcus and I had crossed paths many times in the gritty field. He was a man who recognized true, undeniable competence when he saw it. When the industry rumors definitively confirmed I had been unceremoniously dumped by my own family, Marcus did not waste a single second gloating. He called my personal cell phone within hours of the Odessa EPA shutdown. I slid into the cold leather booth across from him. Marcus signaled the waiter and ordered me a glass of his best bourbon. He did not offer any fake sympathy or waste time with polite small talk. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and laid a massive, thick, leather-bound legal folder on the center of the table. He told me point blank that he knew exactly what was happening at my father's rapidly collapsing company. He knew all about the EPA shutdown caused by Preston's incompetence. He knew about the Corpus Christi disaster and the environmental fines heading their way. And most importantly, he knew that the massive Chevron contract, the $1.2 billion crown jewel that my father was desperately using to entice the acquisition firm and secure Preston's massive inheritance, was hanging by a very thin, frayed thread. Marcus took a slow sip of his bourbon. He told me that Apex wanted the Chevron contract, and they wanted to crush my father's company in the process. He admitted that while Apex had the immense manpower and the financial capital to take over the project seamlessly, they severely lacked the specific, niche operational knowledge and the deep contractor goodwill required to execute it on Chevron's impossibly tight timeline. Then, with a shark-like grin, he slid the heavy legal folder across the mahogany table toward me. He told me he did not want to hire me as a standard employee. He wanted to bring me on as a senior partner and the official vice president of pipeline operations for the entirety of Apex Infrastructure. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the heavily drafted legal jargon. The contract included a guaranteed base salary that literally tripled what my father had been paying me, a massive, life-changing signing bonus, and most importantly, an immediate vested equity stake in Apex Infrastructure. It was a golden ticket. It was the exact kind of immense wealth, corporate power, and deep professional respect I had spent 15 years begging my own family for, handed to me by their absolute greatest enemy without a single moment of hesitation. But Marcus had one major, non-negotiable condition. He needed me to look him in the eye and guarantee that if Apex made a highly aggressive corporate play to steal the Chevron contract, I could bring my key elite personnel, loyal men like Mateo and Hector, and vital, independent contractors like Gideon over to Apex with me. I looked down. I shook Marcus's hand firmly, finished my bourbon in one swallow, and walked out into the warm, humid Texas evening. The storm my family had started was no longer something I was hiding from. I was the storm now, and I was bringing it directly to their front door. The phone call that officially set the stage for the final confrontation came on a late Thursday afternoon, right as I was finalizing my extensive executive onboarding paperwork with Marcus in the heavily air-conditioned, incredibly quiet executive suite at the Apex Infrastructure headquarters. My personal cell phone vibrated aggressively against the massive, polished mahogany conference table. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller ID flashed a number I had intentionally avoided blocking during my digital purge. Fiona from Human Resources. I picked it up immediately, knowing full well that a woman as cautious and professional as Fiona would absolutely not call me unless the corporate office was completely engulfed in a massive, uncontrollable fire. Fiona sounded entirely exhausted, her usually cheerful and composed voice completely stripped of any standard corporate pretense. She sounded like a woman who had not slept in 3 days and was surviving purely on black coffee and sheer panic. She told me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, that the board of directors had abruptly scheduled a mandatory, emergency, all-hands crisis meeting for exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning. She explicitly stated that my father, Gregory, had personally marched down to her office, bypassed all standard protocols, and ordered her to extend a formal, highly urgent invitation directly to me. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and asked her, genuinely curious, why on earth they would possibly want the man they had ruthlessly fired at 1 in the morning to attend a high-level board meeting just 48 hours later. Fiona took a deep, shaky breath that I could clearly hear through the receiver. She carefully explained the catastrophic situation. Diana, the incredibly powerful, notoriously strict lead regional project supervisor for Chevron, was currently flying into Houston on a private corporate jet specifically to attend this Friday morning meeting. Diana was a highly respected, fiercely intelligent woman who personally managed billions of dollars in critical energy infrastructure contracts across the entire southern United States. She was absolutely not someone you could easily manipulate with fake, glossy spreadsheets, empty promises, or hollow corporate buzzwords. The reality on the ground was undeniable. The massive $1.2 billion pipeline project was completely, utterly paralyzed. The federal EPA agents had officially placed heavy iron padlocks on the Odessa site gates, indefinitely halting all progress. The Corpus Christi pump station was sitting entirely abandoned in a massive pool of highly toxic, hazardous industrial sludge, facing millions in repair costs and environmental fines. And Fiona warned me, her voice trembling, that Sylvia and Uncle Wallace had spent the entire previous night huddled in the executive suite with their most expensive, ruthless corporate defense lawyer. They were frantically drafting a highly suspicious, incredibly dense legal document that had my name printed boldly at the top of the first page. I thanked Fiona for her unwavering, incredible loyalty and told her to take care of herself. I hung up the phone and looked across the wide table at Marcus. He was quietly sipping a dark roast coffee and meticulously reading a commercial real estate acquisition report. I cleared my throat and told him that my father had just formally summoned me to the corporate headquarters to face the Chevron executives and answer for the disasters. Marcus slowly lowered his report. He looked at me, and a slow, sharp, incredibly predatory grin spread across his face, a smile that reached his cold, calculating eyes. He closed his leather folder with a loud snap, leaned back in his executive chair, and told me to make sure I wore my absolute best, most expensive tailored suit tomorrow morning. He said, with absolute, chilling certainty, that it was finally time to step back and let my family enthusiastically dig their own corporate graves. Friday morning in Houston was incredibly, oppressively humid, the kind of heavy, suffocating Texas heat that instantly makes the air feel thick and heavy in your lungs the moment you step outside. I drove my heavy-duty truck toward the sprawling, glass-fronted corporate headquarters I had spent my entire adult life helping to build from the ground up. As I slowly pulled into the massive, perfectly paved executive parking lot, my eyes immediately locked onto Preston's bright, obnoxious red Ferrari. It was parked horribly, diagonally across two reserved, handicapped accessible spaces directly near the front glass doors. It was a glaring, undeniable symbol of the exact, unchecked entitlement and gross incompetence that was currently burning the entire company to the ground. Walking through that grand, multi-story marble lobby felt entirely, fundamentally different this time. For 15 agonizing years, I had walked through these heavy glass doors with a massive, crushing burden permanently resting on my shoulders. My mind had always been constantly, frantically calculating logistics, reviewing union payroll, memorizing safety protocols, and anticipating the next inevitable disaster. Today, however, I walked in completely and utterly untethered. I felt lighter than air. The security guards and the receptionists at the front desk looked at me with wide, panicked, deeply uncomfortable eyes. They were all clearly aware of the catastrophic, highly dramatic events that had unfolded over the past 48 hours. I did not stop to chat. I simply gave them a polite, firm nod and stepped directly into the private, wood-paneled executive elevator. When the polished steel doors finally slid silently open on the top floor, the sheer, oppressive tension hanging in the air was thick enough to cut with a serrated knife. I walked slowly, deliberately down the long, carpeted hallway toward the main, glass-enclosed boardroom. Through the transparent walls, I could clearly see the major players already awkwardly assembling for the slaughter. I reached out, pushed the heavy oak door open, and stepped confidently into the room. The nervous, scattered conversations instantly died. The silence that fell over the massive boardroom was absolutely deafening. Sitting at the absolute head of the massive, custom-built mahogany table was my father. He looked terrible. He looked like he had physically aged 5 hard years in just 2 days. His usually perfectly tailored, expensive suit looked slightly rumpled and loose, and the deep, dark purple circles under his bloodshot eyes spoke volumes about his total lack of sleep and mounting panic. To his immediate right sat Sylvia, my stepmother. She was heavily draped in expensive, flashy designer jewelry, desperately trying to project an aura of completely unearned, aristocratic superiority, though her trademark pageant smile was incredibly tight, forced, and trembling slightly at the edges. Next to her was Preston. The golden child was sweating profusely, his face pale, aggressively bouncing his knee up and down under the table in a rapid, nervous rhythm that was gently shaking the coffee cups. Uncle Wallace sat in the far corner, clutching a thick, heavy legal folder to his chest, looking exactly like a cornered snake desperately waiting for the right moment to strike. And sitting directly across from them, radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated, cold professional fury, was Diana from Chevron. I did not say a single word. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply walked over, pulled out a heavy leather chair on the exact opposite end of the long table, and sat down. I folded my hands neatly in front of me and waited. My father loudly cleared his throat, desperately attempting to project the dominant, fearless CEO persona that was rapidly slipping through his trembling fingers. He looked nervously at Diana, forced a deeply uncomfortable, placating smile, and began his carefully, meticulously rehearsed script. He announced to the room, his voice slightly higher than normal, that he was incredibly glad and relieved that I had decided to join them this morning. He looked directly into my eyes and stated, with a completely straight face, that the company was currently facing a series of unfortunate, completely unforeseen operational hurdles. But, he added smoothly, family always comes together in times of severe crisis to support one another. I simply stared at him, my face a perfect, unreadable mask, completely refusing to offer him a single, microscopic word of validation or comfort. Sylvia, sensing the agonizing silence, seamlessly picked up the false narrative. She leaned forward elegantly, resting her manicured hands on the table, using her softest, most highly manipulative Southern belle voice. She looked directly at Diana and smoothly explained that while her son, Preston, was an absolute, undeniable visionary when it came to long-term strategic corporate development, the truly unfortunate events of the past 2 days were the direct, undeniable result of a highly negligent, incredibly sloppy operational handover. She actually had the absolute, staggering audacity to claim, right to my face, that I had intentionally, maliciously left the vital construction sites in a state of administrative disarray and chaos out of pure spite before my abrupt departure. Preston eagerly, desperately nodded along with his mother, frantically wiping the heavy sweat from his pale forehead with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. He stammered out a weak, pathetic agreement, claiming to Diana that he had walked blindly into a complete logistical nightmare, and that the safety protocols I had carelessly left behind were entirely insufficient and wildly outdated. I kept my face perfectly, entirely blank. The sheer, staggering level of psychological gaslighting happening in that room was almost clinically impressive. They had maliciously orchestrated my brutal, illegal termination in the middle of the night, happily handed the keys to a completely incompetent, spoiled child, caused a massive federal EPA shutdown, literally blew up a multi-million-dollar piece of critical infrastructure, and now they were actively, aggressively trying to frame me for the entire catastrophic disaster right in front of our biggest, most important client. Seeing that I was not taking the bait and defending myself, Uncle Wallace finally made his calculated move. He slowly slid the thick, heavy legal folder across the expanse of the polished mahogany table toward me. He looked at me with a sickeningly smug, incredibly confident expression. He told me, using his most condescending, arrogant corporate lawyer voice, that the board of directors had generously drafted a comprehensive, highly beneficial settlement agreement. He explicitly stated, emphasizing every word, that if I simply signed the document today, the company would officially, legally agree not to pursue a massive, career-ending civil lawsuit against me for gross negligence, willful misconduct, and deliberate corporate sabotage. I reached out slowly and opened the heavy folder. The dense legal document inside was an absolute masterpiece of corporate fiction and coercion. It was a heavily worded, incredibly restrictive non-disclosure agreement securely combined with a full, legally binding admission of professional fault. It explicitly stated, in black and white, that I took full, unconditional, and sole responsibility for the EPA environmental violations in Odessa and the catastrophic dangerous equipment failure in Corpus Christi. I took my time reading the key paragraphs. Then, I looked up from the document and locked eyes directly with my father. I asked him, keeping my tone completely even, chillingly calm, and devoid of any emotion, what exactly I was supposed to receive in exchange for willingly signing away my entire professional reputation and legally admitting to federal crimes I did absolutely not commit. My father leaned forward eagerly, tightly clasping his hands together on the table. He tried desperately to look benevolent, like a merciful king generously granting a pardon to a treasonous, ungrateful peasant. He told me that despite my massive, highly public failures, he was personally willing to offer me a clear path toward professional redemption. He stated, his chest puffing out slightly, that the company would officially rehire me today. I would be given the brand new title of operational director. However, he quickly added, due to the massive, ongoing financial damages I had supposedly caused the company, my base salary would be permanently cut by 40%. And, most importantly, I would no longer have executive autonomy. I would report directly every single day to Preston, executing his strategic vision in the field and handling the manual labor. I stared at him, letting the absolute insanity of his offer truly sink in. They wanted me to sign a legally binding document that completely absolved Preston of all legal, financial, and criminal responsibility. They desperately wanted to use my flawless, 15-year industry reputation to miraculously calm Diana down and save the massive Chevron contract. And then, as the ultimate insult, they wanted to chain me to a desk, paying me a tiny fraction of my actual worth, while forcing me to serve and clean up after the very brother who had maliciously stolen my entire inheritance. It was the ultimate, deeply insulting trap, set by people completely, entirely blinded by their own towering, narcissistic arrogance. They genuinely, truly believed that because I had always dutifully cleaned up their massive messes in the past, because I had always craved my father's approval, I would eagerly, pathetically fall on my sword one last time just to remain in their toxic, abusive orbit. They thought I was a broken, desperate, terrified man who would thankfully take whatever miserable, insulting scraps they decided to throw onto the floor. I slowly closed the heavy legal folder. I placed my hands flat on it and pushed it slowly, deliberately back across the long table toward Uncle Wallace. The entire room held its collective breath. The trap was fully set, the bait was placed, and they were entirely unprepared for the sheer, unrelenting violence of the storm that was about to hit them. The silence in the boardroom stretched out, becoming tight, heavy, and as fragile as a drawn tripwire. Sylvia's fake, heavily painted-on smile began to falter significantly, the corners of her mouth twitching downward. Preston completely stopped bouncing his leg, freezing in place and staring at the closed legal folder sitting in front of Uncle Wallace as if it were an active, ticking hand grenade. My father deeply frowned, the veins in his neck bulging, clearly infuriated that I had not immediately grabbed a pen, signed my life away, and wept with gratitude for his profound mercy. I looked directly at Uncle Wallace first. I kept my voice incredibly steady and intentionally quiet, forcing them to lean in to hear me. I told him his legal drafting skills were certainly incredibly creative, a real work of fiction, but the document sitting in front of him was entirely worthless. I stated clearly and unequivocally that I would absolutely not, under any circumstances, be signing a fraudulent illegal confession to cover up the gross, undeniable negligence and staggering incompetence of their brand new Vice President of Strategic Development. My father lost his mind. He violently slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, the loud, sharp crack echoing painfully off the thick glass walls. He immediately raised his voice to a booming shout, abandoning the benevolent, merciful King act entirely. He aggressively, wildly warned me that I was making a massive, life-altering, completely unforgivable mistake. He threatened to unleash the company's full, incredibly expensive legal team to utterly destroy my life. He aggressively claimed they would tie me up in endless, draining litigation for the next decade, actively garnish any future salary I ever managed to make, and personally ensure, through his vast network of contacts, that I never worked a single day in the pipeline industry again. He was literally screaming about family loyalty, about the blood we shared, willfully ignoring the fact that he was the exact man who had brutally severed those very ties at 1 a.m. to protect his own greed. I let him completely finish his pathetic, red-faced tantrum. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not show a single ounce of fear, intimidation, or hesitation. I simply turned my heavy leather chair slightly to the right, ignoring my father completely as if he did not exist, and focused my entire, undivided attention directly on Diana from Chevron. I addressed her with the utmost, formal professional respect, ignoring the chaos to my left. I asked Diana, considering she personally managed billions of dollars in highly critical, strictly regulated energy infrastructure, if she genuinely, truly believed a single word of the ridiculous, highly fabricated fairy tale my family had just presented to her regarding the site failures. Diana did not blink. She had been sitting there silently for 20 straight minutes, quietly absorbing the incredibly toxic, highly dysfunctional dynamic of my family with the cold, calculating, analytical gaze of an apex corporate predator. She slowly, deliberately placed her incredibly expensive leather portfolio on the table. She unzipped it and pulled out a thick stack of heavily redacted, highly technical corporate reports. When Diana finally spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her voice was absolute, unforgiving ice. She stated, looking directly at my father, that Chevron did not operate a billion-dollar enterprise on blind faith, nepotism, or highly dramatic family gossip. She stated firmly that Chevron operated purely on hard, verifiable digital data. She then slowly turned her head and looked directly at Preston. I physically watched the remaining color drain entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. Diana revealed to the completely stunned room that immediately following the federal EPA shutdown in Odessa and the catastrophic pump station explosion in Corpus Christi, Chevron had rapidly initiated a severe, independent, third-party emergency audit of the project's entire digital footprint. She told the room that Chevron's elite cybersecurity team had successfully, legally pulled the unalterable, heavily encrypted server logs directly from the Corpus Christi site's main control panel. She opened the report and read directly from the highlighted text. The server logs explicitly, undeniably proved that Preston had used his newly acquired, highly classified administrative credentials to manually override the primary, automated safety lockouts. The logs showed the exact timestamp of his action, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his direct input caused the catastrophic high-pressure valve failure. Furthermore, she revealed, her voice rising in power, that Chevron investigators had already secured sworn, notarized affidavits from Hector and the entire engineering crew on site. These statements explicitly confirmed that Preston had aggressively threatened them with immediate termination and career destruction if they did not break federal safety protocols to speed up the process. Diana then slowly turned her icy, devastating glare towards Sylvia and my father, who were both sitting frozen in absolute shock. She explicitly stated that attempting to legally frame an innocent, highly competent former employee to maliciously cover up the monumental, dangerous incompetence of an executive officer was not just a massive breach of trust. It was a fundamental, unforgivable, legally actionable breach of their master corporate contract. Sylvia completely panicked. Her carefully crafted Southern Belle mask shattered into a million sharp, desperate pieces. She started talking incredibly rapidly, waving her heavily jeweled hands in the air, desperately trying to interrupt Diana's flow. She frantically claimed the cybersecurity reports were somehow fabricated, that the disgruntled union employees were simply lying to protect me because I was their friend. She leaned across the table and practically begged Diana to give Preston just one more chance, frantically promising that they would immediately hire a massive team of incredibly expensive, independent consultants to fix the environmental damage at their own expense. Diana held up a single, perfectly manicured finger, silencing Sylvia instantly. The sheer, overwhelming corporate power radiating from the Chevron executive in that moment was magnificent to witness. Diana looked dead at my father and delivered the absolute, final killing blow. She stated, clearly and loudly, that as of 8 o'clock that very morning, the Chevron Corporation was formally, legally, and permanently terminating their $1.2 billion master services agreement with the company, effective immediately. She cited gross, undeniable negligence, severe environmental endangerment, and a complete, systemic, unfixable failure of executive leadership and ethics. Furthermore, she announced without a hint of emotion that Chevron's massive legal department was actively, aggressively preparing a massive civil lawsuit to fully recover all financial damages, lost profits, and EPA fines caused directly by the severe delays in Odessa and Corpus Christi. The reaction in the room was a portrait of absolute, pure, unadulterated devastation. Preston completely broke down. He buried his pale face in his hands, completely hyperventilating, emitting high-pitched, panicked sobbing sounds. Uncle Wallace stared blankly at the far wall, his jaw hanging open, rapidly calculating exactly how much of his personal, ill-gotten wealth he was about to lose in the impending, unavoidable corporate bankruptcy. My father sat completely paralyzed in his oversized executive chair. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and unseeing, looking exactly like a man who had just watched his entire life's work, his legacy, and his entire identity burned to ash in front of his very eyes. The massive corporate acquisition they had so carefully, ruthlessly planned, the massive sale that was supposed to secure Preston's massive inheritance and their luxurious retirement, was instantly, permanently dead. The company, burdened with massive debt and overhead, was functionally, undeniably worthless without the massive Chevron contract to keep the lights on. My father, desperate, entirely broken, and terrified beyond words, slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. He actually had the unbelievable, staggering audacity to ask me for help. He stammered, his voice weak and pathetic, desperately asking if there was any possible way I could use my deep, long-standing relationship with Diana to somehow smooth this massive disaster over. He offered me absolutely whatever I wanted. He frantically promised full equity, a massively higher salary, a permanent seat on the board of directors, the title of CEO. He was entirely willing to give me the world, now that his own world was actively, violently ending in front of him. I looked at the man who had treated me like a disposable, unfeeling tool for 15 agonizing years. I looked at the man who had fired me in the dark to steal my future. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sadness, no pity. Just a cold, heavy, incredibly satisfying sense of absolute finality. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and slowly, deliberately pulled out the heavy, leather-bound folder Marcus had given me the night before at the steakhouse. I placed it gently on the table in front of me, making sure the gold-embossed Apex Infrastructure logo was clearly visible. I looked at my father, then at Sylvia's tear-streaked, ruined face, and finally at Preston's shaking form. I spoke with absolute, crystal clarity, ensuring every single word carved itself deeply into their memories forever. I told them that I could not possibly accept their incredibly generous offer of employment, because I was already fully, legally committed elsewhere. I formally, coldly reintroduced myself to my own family. I announced, my voice echoing in the quiet room, that I was the brand new senior partner and vice president of pipeline operations for Apex Infrastructure. My father physically recoiled, throwing himself back against his chair as if he had been shot point blank in the chest. Apex was his greatest, most hated enemy. The devastating realization of exactly what I had done, and the sheer scale of his own defeat, hit him with the unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. I turned back to Diana, my expression softening slightly. I asked her, keeping my tone perfectly professional, if the new transition paperwork had been fully processed by her legal team. Diana finally smiled. It was a genuine, deeply satisfied, incredibly shark-like smile. She confirmed that it had been finalized an hour ago. She announced to the horrified, completely destroyed room that Chevron had successfully, legally diverted the entire $1.2 billion infrastructure contract directly over to Apex Infrastructure. She stated, twisting the knife one final time, that the only reason Chevron had ever remained with my father's outdated company for so long was entirely because of my personal guarantee of safety, my deep contractor relationships, and my flawless operational excellence. The very moment they found out I was unjustly terminated, they immediately initiated the transfer to wherever I landed. The massive billion-dollar contract had officially followed me. I had not just quietly left my family's toxic, abusive empire. I had actively, intentionally ripped its beating financial heart out of its chest and handed it directly to their absolute worst, most aggressive nightmare. I stood up slowly from the table, calmly buttoning my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at the completely shattered, broken, silent people sitting around the massive mahogany table. I looked directly into my father's tear-filled eyes and told him that he was absolutely right about one thing during our midnight phone call. I told him the organizational restructuring had been incredibly, ruthlessly efficient. Without waiting for a single response, without offering a single look of sympathy, I turned my back on them and walked confidently out of the boardroom. I left them entirely alone to face the catastrophic, multi-million-dollar ruins of the empire they had selfishly, arrogantly destroyed. The immediate, visceral aftermath of the boardroom massacre was a spectacle of absolute, unfiltered, incredibly loud chaos. I did not stay in the room to watch the entire meltdown, but the heavy glass walls of the conference room offered absolutely no soundproofing against the sheer volume of their utter despair and rage. As I walked slowly and deliberately down the long, carpeted executive hallway, I clearly heard Sylvia completely lose her mind. The carefully constructed, elegant, aristocratic facade she had meticulously maintained for decades violently, instantly evaporated. She was screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, an ugly, piercing, hysterical sound. She was wildly blaming Uncle Wallace, screaming that his aggressively drafted termination papers were the sole trigger for this entire disaster. Uncle Wallace, ever the cowardly, self-serving snake, was shouting right back at her at the top of his lungs. He was frantically trying to distance himself from the massive legal fallout, aggressively dialing his personal corporate defense lawyer on his cell phone before Diana had even stood up to leave the room. Preston, the pampered, useless golden child who was supposed to effortlessly inherit the earth, was curled tightly in his expensive leather executive chair, sobbing openly and loudly like a terrified toddler. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to deflect the massive blame crashing down on him, He started screaming hysterically at Derek, who was hovering nervously and sweating near the boardroom door. Preston tried to loudly claim that Derek was the one who had physically forced him to pull the manual override lever at the Corpus Christi pump station. Derek, finally realizing that his career was completely dead and that kissing up to Preston had ruined his life, finally snapped. He yelled back at Preston, his voice cracking with rage, calling him an incompetent, spoiled, incredibly stupid child right in front of the CEO and the Chevron executive. And my father, Gregory, just sat there in absolute total silence. I glanced back through the glass one final time before stepping onto the elevator. He was staring blankly at the empty space on the mahogany table where my Apex folder had rested. He was clutching his chest with one hand, looking exactly like a hollow, defeated, utterly broken ghost of a man. He had coldly traded his most loyal, hard-working son for a mirage of immense wealth and a peaceful retirement. And now, because of his own towering greed, he had absolutely nothing left. I stopped by Fiona's desk on my way out to the lobby. She was standing up, watching the incredible screaming match through the glass with wide, completely shocked eyes. I smiled warmly at her, slid my plastic corporate access badge across her desk, and told her gently that she might want to start updating her resume and packing her personal items immediately. She nodded slowly, a complex look of profound respect and slight terror on her face. I walked out of the corporate building and into the bright, blinding, incredibly hot Texas sunlight. The oppressive, heavy humidity that usually suffocated me no longer bothered me in the slightest. I pulled out my personal phone and called Nina. When she answered, her voice tight with anticipation, I didn't give her a long, drawn-out explanation. I simply took a deep breath of the warm air and told her it was entirely done. The monster was completely dead, and we were finally, truly free. The overwhelming, incredibly powerful sense of pure, unadulterated relief that washed over my entire body as I started my truck engine was completely indescribable. The complete, total collapse of my father's massive corporate empire did not happen overnight, but the slow, agonizing, highly public bleed was utterly devastating to watch. Over the next 9 incredibly busy months, I watched from the highly comfortable, incredibly profitable executive offices of Apex Infrastructure as the natural, unavoidable consequences of my family's staggering arrogance violently tore their lives apart piece by piece. Without the massive billion-dollar Chevron contract serving as the foundational anchor for their financials, the major investment banks immediately panicked. They swiftly called in the massive, high-interest corporate loans my father had carelessly, aggressively leveraged to fund his poorly planned, rapid expansions over the last 5 years. When the official word spread through the tight-knit pipeline industry that I was firmly established as the vice president at Apex, the mass employee exodus immediately began. Mateo, Hector, and nearly every single experienced, highly skilled crew chief, safety inspector, and heavy machinery operator resigned from my father's company en masse and applied for positions directly at Apex. I hired every single one of them, honoring their loyalty with massive pay bumps and better benefits. Gideon, the gruff, incredibly powerful logistics contractor, officially signed an exclusive, multi-year master agreement with Apex, completely and permanently blacklisting my father's company from ever utilizing his massive, essential equipment fleet again. My father's company was completely, functionally paralyzed. They physically could not staff their remaining, significantly smaller projects. Without the manpower or the equipment, they severely missed critical contractual deadlines across the state, instantly triggering a vicious, endless avalanche of financial penalty clauses that drained their operating accounts dry. The personal, private fallout for my family was even more catastrophic, messy, and humiliating than the corporate ruin, as the corporate bank accounts were completely drained to fight the massive, aggressive Chevron civil lawsuit and pay off the staggering EPA environmental fines. Sylvia quickly realized her lavish, country club lifestyle was officially over. True to her predatory, highly calculating nature, the very moment the money dried up, her supposed undying loyalty completely vanished. She filed for a highly aggressive, incredibly messy, incredibly public divorce. She hired a team of the most vicious, expensive divorce lawyers in Houston, desperately trying to legally lock down the expensive real estate, the vacation homes, and the offshore accounts before the federal bankruptcy courts could seize them to pay the corporate debt. The bitter, highly publicized legal battles completely drained whatever meager cash reserves my father had left. Preston's spectacular, incredibly rapid downfall was perhaps the most deeply satisfying to casually observe from afar. The failing company could no longer afford the exorbitant, ridiculous monthly lease on his brand-new Porsche, and it was humiliatingly repossessed directly from the corporate parking lot in broad daylight while his remaining employees watched. To pay for his mounting, incredibly expensive personal legal defense fees regarding his direct involvement in the environmental disaster, Sylvia was forced to completely liquidate his supposedly untouchable college fund and force the immediate sale of the Ferrari she had bought him. The golden child, the boy who had never worked a hard day in his entire privileged life, was suddenly a 27-year-old, completely unemployed liability with a massive, highly publicized record of gross corporate negligence that made him entirely unemployable in the industry. By the end of the 9th month, the dire situation had finally reached its absolute, pathetic, undeniable bottom. The company was officially forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. To satisfy the rabid, angry creditors and actively avoid potential federal prison time for gross financial mismanagement and fraud, my father and Uncle Wallace were ordered by a strict federal bankruptcy judge to completely liquidate all remaining physical corporate assets. This meant hosting a massive fire sale, selling off millions of dollars worth of heavy, specialized excavators, industrial transport trucks, and highly specific pipeline equipment. In the highly specialized, incredibly expensive pipeline infrastructure industry, there are only a very few select companies with the massive liquid capital required to purchase that amount of heavy equipment in a bulk, all-cash fire sale. Apex Infrastructure was sitting comfortably at the very top of that incredibly short list. Marcus, fully understanding the poetic justice of the situation, called me into his office and asked me if I personally wanted to handle the final acquisition negotiations. He knew exactly what it meant to me to be the one to deliver the final blow. I accepted his offer immediately. The final, highly anticipated meeting took place in a sterile, windowless, incredibly cold conference room at a neutral, third-party bankruptcy law firm in downtown Houston. When I confidently walked into the room, carrying a slim leather briefcase, my father and Uncle Wallace were already sitting slumped at the table, flanked by two incredibly exhausted-looking, highly stressed bankruptcy lawyers. My father looked entirely, fundamentally broken. He had lost a significant amount of weight. His once expensive, tailored suit hung incredibly loosely on his shrinking frame, and the arrogant, aggressive fire that used to burn constantly in his eyes was completely, permanently extinguished. Uncle Wallace looked incredibly nervous, constantly checking his expensive watch, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking like a man who knew he was about to lose everything. They did not know I was the designated executive buyer representing Apex. When I walked confidently through the heavy door and took the seat directly across from them, my father physically flinched, shrinking back into his chair. The absolute, crushing, undeniable humiliation of having to sell the remaining, rusting scraps of his proud, family legacy to the exact son he had callously, brutally thrown away was clearly agonizing for him to process. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of greeting or sympathy. I remained entirely cold, fiercely professional, and brutally efficient. I opened the valuation folder and slid the final, legally binding purchase agreement across the wide table. I told them, my voice entirely flat, that Apex was willing to purchase the entire fleet of equipment to take it off their hands, but we were absolutely not going to pay market value for poorly maintained, heavily used machinery. I explicitly stated that we were offering exactly 40 cents on the dollar. A massive, devastating, non-negotiable 60% discount on the total valuation. Uncle Wallace instantly started to protest, his voice shrill and panicked, loudly arguing that the specialized equipment was worth millions more and that the aggressive bank creditors would never, ever accept such an incredibly lowball offer. I cut him off immediately, raising my hand. I looked directly at the highly stressed bankruptcy lawyers and firmly reminded them that Apex was the only company in the entire state with the massive, liquid cash reserves ready to close this massive deal by Friday afternoon. I told them bluntly that if they foolishly rejected the offer today, the heavy equipment would sit rusting in a dirt lot, depreciating in value daily, while the angry federal creditors began legally seizing their personal assets, their homes, and their remaining bank accounts. My father stared down at the harsh contract for a very long time. His hands, resting on the table, were visibly shaking. He finally realized, with absolute terrifying clarity, that he had absolutely zero leverage left. He had no corporate power, no vast wealth, and no proud legacy left to protect. He slowly picked up a cheap, plastic pen provided by the law firm, slowly lowered his defeated head, and signed the total unconditional surrender of his entire empire. The loud, incredibly harsh scratching sound of my father's cheap plastic pen violently tearing against the heavy, legal paper echoed loudly in the sterile, windowless conference room. With a few shaky, desperate signatures, the massive corporate empire I had sacrificed my entire youth, my health, and my peace of mind to build, the company that had defined his entire arrogant, deeply flawed existence, completely ceased to exist. Uncle Wallace immediately snatched his personal copy of the finalized documents and practically ran out of the room, desperate to escape the suffocating, unbearable humiliation of the moment. The two highly stressed bankruptcy lawyers quickly packed up their heavy leather briefcases, offering polite, entirely hollow, and deeply uncomfortable congratulations on closing the massive deal, and quickly exited the room. They left just me and my father entirely alone in the sudden, incredibly heavy quiet of the room. I calmly, methodically gathered the signed contracts, ensuring every page was present, placed them neatly inside my slim leather briefcase, and stood up to leave. I had a massive, highly important corporate integration meeting to run at Apex in an hour, and I did not want to waste a single second more on a man who was now essentially a ghost to me. As I confidently reached for the heavy metal door handle, my father finally spoke. His voice was incredibly weak, a raspy, pathetic whisper of a man who had finally, completely lost everything he ever valued. He softly called my name. He asked me, his voice trembling, to please wait just a minute. I stopped walking. My hand rested firmly on the cold metal handle, but I did not turn around to face him. I stared straight ahead at the blank wall, my posture completely rigid. He started to ramble, his words stumbling over each other in a deeply pathetic, desperate attempt to somehow rewrite the incredibly toxic history of our relationship. He said, his voice cracking, that he knew he had made some terrible, catastrophic mistakes over the last few years. He desperately claimed that Sylvia had actively poisoned his mind against me, that he was under immense, crushing financial pressure regarding the corporate acquisition, and that the stress had caused him to completely lose sight of what was truly, deeply important in life. Then, he made the ultimate, unforgivable, entirely repulsive mistake. In a last, desperate bid to manipulate my emotions, he tried to weaponize the sacred memory of my dead mother. He took a slow, shuffling step toward my back and said, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow, that my mother would be entirely, completely heartbroken to see us completely estranged and fighting like this. He actually had the absolute, staggering nerve to bring up her funeral, claiming that he had stood by her grave and promised her he would always fiercely look out for me. He said that despite everything that had happened, despite the lawsuits and the bankruptcy, we were still blood. He asked, his voice cracking with incredibly fake, manipulative emotion, if there was any possible way we could slowly start over. If maybe, somewhere down the line, I could find it in my heart to secure a small, highly paid consulting position for Preston at Apex, just to help the poor boy get back on his feet after the horrific divorce. The sheer, breathtaking, mind-boggling audacity of his incredibly selfish request instantly extinguished any lingering, microscopic trace of pity or sympathy I might have unconsciously held for him. I turned around slowly, deliberately, and looked him directly in his bloodshot, desperate eyes. I made absolutely sure my expression was completely, entirely void of any anger, sadness, or lingering familial warmth. I looked at him the exact same way I would look at a severely defective, completely useless piece of broken industrial machinery. I spoke with a quiet, lethal, incredibly intense clarity. I told him, pointing a firm finger at him, to never, ever invoke my mother's name again in a pathetic attempt to manipulate me. I firmly reminded him that when he coldly fired me at 1 a.m, discarding me like trash, he explicitly, undeniably proved that shared blood meant absolutely nothing to him unless it was directly tied to his own personal profit margin and his own selfish comfort. I told him, ensuring he understood the reality of his situation, that I did not actively destroy his company. His own towering, unmitigated arrogance, his extreme greed, and his blind, foolish favoritism had destroyed it. I simply stepped out of the way, took my immense value elsewhere, and let the severe, natural consequences of his own horrific actions completely crush him. I looked at his desperate, pleading, tear-stained face and established the final, impenetrable, permanent boundary of my entire life. I told him clearly and definitively that he was officially no longer my father, and Preston was absolutely no longer my brother. I explicitly stated that if he, Sylvia, Preston, or anyone else in his incredibly toxic, abusive family ever attempted to contact me, my wife Nina, or anyone at Apex Infrastructure again, I would immediately unleash a massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers to bury them so incredibly deep in relentless harassment lawsuits they would never see financial daylight again. I turned the heavy handle, opened the door, and walked out into the busy, brightly lit hallway. I did not look back, not even for a second. I left him standing entirely alone in the cold, windowless room, completely surrounded by the physical, undeniable evidence of his total, self-inflicted ruin. Walking out of that law firm, stepping into the bright afternoon sun, was the most profoundly liberating, incredibly peaceful moment of my entire existence. The heavy, suffocating, rusted iron chain that had been tightly, painfully wrapped around my neck for 15 years was finally, completely, and permanently shattered. 2 incredibly fast, highly successful years have passed since that final, definitive meeting in the bankruptcy office. Apex Infrastructure has completely, undeniably dominated the entire Southern Pipeline region. We successfully executed the massive Chevron contract 6 months ahead of schedule and significantly under the projected budget, securing our reputation as the absolute best in the business. Marcus proved to be a tough, demanding, but incredibly fair and honorable partner. He was a man who actively rewarded true competence and fierce loyalty with actual, highly lucrative equity and deep professional respect, not empty, manipulative promises and psychological gaslighting. Mateo is now my highly paid lead regional director. Hector successfully manages the entire complex mechanical division, and Gideon has massively expanded his logistics fleet simply to keep up with our incredible, non-stop demand. We successfully built a thriving corporate culture based on mutual respect, incredibly hard work, and the absolute, ironclad assurance that no loyal employee would ever be fired in the middle of the night to protect a completely useless golden child. But my greatest, most profound success has absolutely nothing to do with pipelines, lucrative corporate contracts, or massive wealth accumulation. Nina and I finally, joyfully bought that specific piece of real estate we had dreamed about and saved for over the years. It is a beautiful, sprawling, incredibly peaceful property situated far outside the busy city limits, completely surrounded by massive, ancient oak trees, incredibly far away from the toxic, gossipy noise of Houston high society. We got married in a beautiful, small, incredibly quiet ceremony surrounded only by the genuine people who had actively, consistently proven their deep love and unwavering loyalty to us. There were no incredibly expensive, overly catered dinners, no manipulative, passive-aggressive speeches from jealous stepmothers, and absolutely no exhausting family drama. One quiet Sunday afternoon, shortly after we fully moved into our beautiful new home, I was unpacking the very last few cardboard boxes in my new, sunlit home office. I reached deep into the bottom of a dusty box and pulled out a heavy, polished mahogany plaque. It was a 10-year dedicated service award my father had casually given me years ago. It was a cheap, meaningless token meant to manipulate me into continuing to work exhausting 80-hour weeks while Preston was effortlessly handed a multi-million-dollar trust fund and luxury cars. I stared at the heavy wooden plaque for a long, quiet moment, felt entirely foreign and completely weightless in my hands. It was a dusty relic from a past life that belonged to a completely different, deeply broken, incredibly sad man. I walked out the front door, down the long gravel driveway, to the large metal trash bin sitting by the edge of our property. I dropped the heavy plaque directly into the garbage without a single second of hesitation, regret, or sadness. It landed with a dull, highly satisfying thud among the discarded, useless packing materials. I walked back into the bright, warm, incredibly welcoming house. Nina was standing in the kitchen, laughing loudly on the phone with Fiona, who had recently, highly deservedly accepted a massive promotion to become the VP of Human Resources at Apex. I walked over, wrapped my arms tightly around Nina's waist, breathing in the comforting scent of our new home, feeling an overwhelming, profound, deeply rooted sense of absolute peace. I had lost my entire toxic biological family, but in the painful, necessary process of finally standing up for my own absolute worth, I had successfully built a real, beautiful, incredibly supportive one. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing for listening to my journey. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this exact point. This simple action not only helps more people discover this important story, but also lets me know that my painful experiences mean something to someone out there. Your support is the greatest, most powerful motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey with you. I learned the absolute hardest, most painful way possible that true, unconditional loyalty should never, ever be blindly given simply because someone happens to share your DNA. If your family consistently demands that you continuously set yourself on fire simply to keep them warm, you are not a loved one. You are a deeply expendable resource. You have the absolute, undeniable right to demand respect, to aggressively protect your own financial and mental future, and to walk entirely away from any toxic, abusive environment that actively devalues your incredible hard work. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, deeply painful line in the sand to protect your own sanity, your financial future, and your self-worth? Share your personal story in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't forget to absolutely smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.